Good morning, everyone. Is the micro on? Yes, good morning, everyone. I think we are ready to start. I have the pleasure to greeting all of you this morning. My name is Stella Rollig. I'm the General Director of Belvedere, and yeah, very, very happy that we are able not only to host a fantastic exhibition, so kudos to you, to the curators in the Eye of the Storm, but also this all-day conference, this symposium today. First, I would like to welcome you as the curators, Katja Denisova and Konstantin Akinja, and the Belvedere's own Miroslav Halak. And I understand that after my welcome, Konstantin and Miroslav will give an introduction into today's program. I especially welcome, of course, all the speakers, experts, guests, especially all of you who have come from abroad to join us, from Ukraine, from the Czech Republic, from Hungary, from Poland, and even from as far as the US, Ohio. Regarding our key speaker tonight. I am happy and grateful to mention three partners of this endeavor. It's the IWM, the Institute for Human Sciences, the Ukrainian Embassy, and the Czech Cultural Center. Thank you all three for supporting this important conference. A brief statement before we go into today's program in detail. Since their beginnings, museums, as the Austrian Gallery Belvedere, have been understood as places of historiography and the formation of identity. This function of constructing history needs to be critically questioned in contemporary museum work. Today, more than ever, it must be a matter of exploring and illuminating different perspectives on historical events and timelines. The exhibition In the Eye of the Storm, Modernisms in Ukraine, shows how it is possible to depict paradoxical historical developments. 100 years later, the right to self-determination is once again being fought for, and Ukrainian sovereignty is threatened. All the more topical is the art of the protagonists who defied fate with their works and conveyed messages of a modern civilization built on cultural values. I think most of you, I do hope all of you, have seen the exhibition and are now familiar with what the curators depict in their panorama of the modernisms in Ukraine in our exhibition at the Lower Belvedere. The modernist movement in Ukraine unfolded against the complicated social political background. At the beginning of the 20th century, there was a national awakening as in other countries. And this is precisely the topic of what we will discuss during this day. Associated with this was the recourse of folk motifs and noticeable national themes in order to develop a national art style with all the contradictions that brings this aim with it, I would say. It was not until 1917 that the first Academy of Fine Arts was founded in Kiev. Until then, artists went to St. Petersburg and Moscow for their studies, but from then on, Ukrainian art centers began strongly to unfold. The exhibition at the Lower Belvedere is situated within a series of exhibitions. Before the series started out at the Thyssen Museum in Madrid, based on a very valuable and very worth mentioning initiative by Francesca Thyssen. It traveled since, but we're very proud to say that here at the Belvedere, it has its largest dimension so far, and afterwards it will travel in several parts to London, to Bratislava next, to Sofia. So it will be here and stay for the next at least months, we hope years, to show the entire Europe and probably beyond how Ukraine has unfolded and developed as a nation in regard to its cultural developments. With today's symposium, we aim to extend the scope and look at the interconnected and evolving modernity within the broader cultural context. At this point, I also want to mention, not really out of topic, but related to it, that the Belvedere has launched last year its very own research journal focused on themes and questions of Central European art history. It's a peer-reviewed scientific journal published online, and we want to extend a big invitation to all of you experts and academics to propose subjects and essays for this journal, and ask for Christian Huema, the head of the research center of the Belvedere, who is also here if you're interested in contributing. Finally, there goes a big thank you to the organizers, all the speakers. Thank you for coming here, and I look very much forward to today's lively exchange. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's also for me as a huge pleasure and honor to be here to organize this symposium. And before we start with the first panel, I will just organize questions for the speakers. Please, we need to hold in this 25-30 minutes, and after each speak we have a short discussion round. I would also say a big thank you for my colleague Maria Pilipenko. Without her support, it will be impossible to organize this symposium. So thank you very much, and I will give now the word to Konstantin Akincha, the curator of the exhibition and also the moderator of the first panel. Thank you.
Yeah, before coming to the first panel, I have to say 2 words about this symposium. First, I am extremely grateful to Galerie Belvedere for those possibilities which we get here. I'm very grateful for support of our colleagues in preparation of exhibition and full endorsement of idea to have such a symposium. I believe that this symposium is necessary. The problem is that Ukrainian art was actually lost on the other side of the Icoman, behind the Iron Curtain, and since the fall of the Soviet Union, it did not become visible enough. We believe that we need to put it in the context of Central European art. We can see many developments which are really reminding us what was happening in Hungary, in Austria, in Poland, in Slovakia. But Ukrainian art historians have no such reference. I can joke that we don't like Russians, but we don't have other reference base. So let's make this reference base a bit broader. Let's try to start to think about writing new version of art history or history of modernism for our part of Europe. Now I'm announcing the beginning of the first panel. Can you please put the first panel? Yeah, that's even too far. Yeah, so the first panel, I want to warn speakers that I will be a draconian moderator. We don't have too much time, so please obey the rule and don't come with presentations which are extending 30 minutes. If they're a bit shorter, it's even better. In first panel, we already addressing interesting issues which are connected with modernism in different Central European lands, from Brno to Ukraine, and to even interesting offer how to reshuffle the history of modernism. So I want to invite, we will have questions after every speech. Very few questions, very short, because it was a discussion to do them after the panel or after every speech. Maybe to do it after every speech is a good idea. So please, let's greet our first speaker.
Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you. My talk is about 30 pages long. Is that okay? Okay. 30. Okay. Yeah. Fine. Well, first of all, I'd like to express my thanks for the invitation to come and speak. It's a great pleasure to come here and to see some familiar faces and also to meet some new people who I've sort of maybe had contact with by email, but that was about the limit, so that's been a great pleasure. Yes, so when I was asked if I'd give a talk, I was asked specifically if I could talk about Brno. And for the Czechs and the Slovaks in the audience, I do have to apologize because maybe some of the things I say about Brno will be familiar, but I'm starting from the point that for many, although they may have a concept of Brno, but they don't know very much of the details. So I'm just going to try and give a sketch of some of the questions and issues that are raised by a consideration of Brno within the first half of, basically the history of modernism from the beginning of the 20th century up till 1939. So in 2018, the Czech National Gallery in Prague opened a new permanent exhibition in the Trade Fair Palace titled The First Czechoslovak Republic. The approach was a remarkably fresh break from the past. Instead of the rather tired and unimaginative presentations of styles and individual stars that had been characteristic of its earlier display of 20th century art, the new hang was organized thematically. The exhibition had sections on key exhibitions and institutions, associations and groups. And perhaps the most striking aspect of the exhibition was its conscious attempt to avoid the Pragocentrism that had bedeviled accounts of modernism until then. Indeed, it's worth noting that only the year before, in 2017, the Institute of Art History in Prague had published a very high-profile popular history of art in English and Czech that made absolutely no mention of Slovakia at all, and which was symptomatic of a kind of older approach that the curators of the exhibition tried to avoid. And indeed, the exhibition acknowledged the existence of Slovakia, with sections devoted to important centers such as Bratislava and Košice, and it also picked up on And it also picked up on the growing interest in the history and culture of Subcarpathian Ruthenia, with a section devoted to Uzhhorod. The exhibition was thus trying to do justice to the artistic geography of Czechoslovakia, and it's for this reason that the city of Brno was also the subject of a considerable amount of attention. Brno has long played a central role in modernism in Czechoslovakia, and subsequently the Czech Republic. The roll call of figures born in Brno reads like a who's who of 20th century European culture, Central European culture, from the architects Jan Kotyera and Adolf Loos through to writers such as Bohumil Hrabal, Milan Kundera, Věra Linhartová, or the poet Ivan Blatný. Although they were not born there, a number of other figures of national cultural importance were associated with the city, and they made it their home, such as Leos Janáček, Dusan Jurkovic, Bohuslav Fuchs, and Arnošt Wiesner. Recent research has emphasized the importance of Brno in terms not only of the contributions of notable individual figures, but also of collective networking practices. For example, there was a Brno branch of the design and art cooperative Devětsil. And Brno also became an important center of modernist publishing activity. Prominent examples included the Moravian Silesian Review that published Cubism by Vincent Kramage, which was the first major study of the subject in any language, as well as avant-garde and leftist magazines in the 1920s, such as Rovnost, Pásmo, and Fronta. After the Second World War, Brno was also home to the art group Blok, one of the most ambitious efforts to revive the spirit of the avant-garde that had been shut down following the Nazi invasion. And its magazine, also called Blok, included essays on topics as diverse as prehistoric art, folk art in America, and the place of contemporary Czechoslovak art. It was shut down in 1949 by the communist authorities. The establishment of an independent Czechoslovakia was of undoubted importance for the history of Brno, and we can even speak of a kind of myth of Brno, the city of the avant-garde. This was given institutional support in 1998, when the City Museum unveiled a new exhibition. I'm not sure where I should be pointing this, actually, but anyway, we're getting there. When the City Museum unveiled an exhibition for New Brno, which was an extensive display documenting in detail the wave of building that began immediately after the First World War and that secured the reputation of a generation of architects who came to professional maturity during the period. And since then, there's been a flood of publications about modern architecture in Brno, of which perhaps the most high profile has been the Brno Architecture Manual. Initially a small-scale project meant to help visitors walking around the city to identify key examples of modernist architecture, but which subsequently developed into an ambitious web project. It's also expanded beyond the original terminus of 1945 to encompass architecture in the city up to the present, and it has produced a number of comparable projects in other cities in the Czech Republic, such as Hradec Králové, Plzeň, Zlín, and Litomyšl. It's even been emulated internationally. The Užhorod Architectural Manual, there, undertakes a similar task of documenting the modernist heritage of the city. It's revealing that the project focuses on the period when it was under Czechoslovak rule. Taken together, these projects provide vivid evidence of a civic pride and a sense of local urban identity that offer important counter-narratives to national histories of modern art and architecture organized around the capital cities. The Brno Architecture Manual is a carefully researched enterprise, and it is an enormously useful resource. So what do I mean when I call it a myth? The term commonly connotes a false or incorrect understanding, but that would certainly be incorrect in relation to the manual or to any of the other projects that took inspiration from it. Instead, in talking of myth, I'm using the term in the way that Roland Barthes did in Mythologie, to denote a kind of what he calls depoliticized speech. As Barthes says, and I quote, "Myth is constituted by the loss of the historical quality of things. In it, things lose the memory that they once were made. The world enters language as a dialectical relation between activities and human actions. It comes out of myth as a harmonious display of essences." Further, he adds, and I quote, "Myth doesn't deny things. On the contrary, its function is to talk about them, but simply it purifies them, makes them innocent. It gives them a natural and eternal justification, and it gives them a clarity which is not that of an explanation, but that of a statement of fact." So what do this clarity, justification, and harmonious display of essences mean in the context of the analysis of modernism in Brno? Well, we can begin to formulate an answer if we consider the circumstances that lay behind the first Czechoslovak Republic exhibition, for it was part of the celebrations of the centenary of the founding of the independent Czechoslovak state in 1918. This was actually, as you entered the exhibition, this is the first thing that you're presented with, which is a whole series of busts of Masaryk. The First Republic has long functioned as a symbolically resonant lieu de mémoire in Czech society for what it represented, a progressive, liberal, democratic state that stood in marked contrast to its neighbors that all, at some time or other, turned into dictatorship. In this political narrative, which also serves to embody certain ideas of Czech national identity, modernist architecture plays an important role as perhaps the most visible expression of that identity. It's no accident that groups in smaller towns have been so quick to highlight the presence in their landscape of notable avant-garde buildings, for alongside municipal pride in historical heritage is one where they want to be part of a narrative of modernization. The attractiveness of the view is not difficult to spot. The story of national renewal was no longer one driven by Prague alone. A decentered artistic geography can lead to a questioning of traditional Prague-centric histories. In the case of Brno, there are numerous examples that illustrate how the city might have fulfilled this function. Brno is best known internationally as the location of the Villa Tugendhat by Mies van der Rohe, the only example of modern architecture in the Czech Republic to be UNESCO listed, and also perhaps one of the few modernist designs to have an established international profile. In addition, the 1928 exhibition of contemporary culture staged in Brno also supports an attempt to create a narrative based around the notion of Brno being at the heart of modernity, modernization in Brno, and of course in Czechoslovakia, my apology. And it was followed in 1929 with the exhibition The Civilized Woman, which seemingly was proof of the willingness of Czechoslovak society to engage with issues of women's emancipation. This account, however, takes on a mythic quality in Barth's sense, inasmuch as it flattens out the complex social and cultural history of Czechoslovakia. And as a result of that, it's gradually come under a more critical scrutiny. In fact, even the exhibition at the National Gallery alluded to this possibility when it fully recognized that the story of art in Prague was not a wholly Czech one. It acknowledged, for example, that the modern gallery of the Kingdom of Bohemia, founded in 1902 in Prague, had separate German and Czech sessions. Likewise, it mentions the Prague Secession, a short-lived artistic group consisting of German-speaking artists between the wars. It's a reflection of the limitations of the exhibition of a medium, of the exhibition as a medium, perhaps, that the complex societal tensions that lay behind this could not be conveyed. Nevertheless, while the display included hitherto peripheral centers and reasons, the presentation of images and sculptures doesn't communicate very well the contradictions and fractures that constituted Czechoslovak society, and that included not only Czechs and Germans, but also Slovaks, Roma, Ruthenians, Hungarians, and Jews. It's at this point we return to Brno, for it embodies well the contradictory strands of identification that ran through the interwar Republic. 2 years after the new hang in the National Gallery, the Moravian Gallery in Prague, what am I talking about? The Moravian Gallery in Brno staged an exhibition called Brno, a Suburb of Vienna, that explored the numerous links between the cities in the late Habsburg Empire. This was in itself not exactly a novel insight. It's long been known that the social and cultural elites of Brno had intimate ties to the capital. The city also long enjoyed a reputation as the Moravian Manchester on account of its extensive textile industry. But in recent years, the implications of this history have begun to be examined in greater depth, with a particular interest in recovering the city's Jewish heritage, specifically the industrialists who formed such an essential part of its social elite. They comprise the background behind the Villa Tugendhat, of course, since Fritz Tugendhat, who commissioned the house, typified this social class. He was the co-owner of wool factories in Brno and Svetavka, which is a small town 40 kilometers north of Brno, and his wife Grete was the daughter of Alfred Löwbeer, a Jewish industrialist who'd been born in Vienna and who gave Fritz and Grete Tugendhat the plot of land on which the Tugendhat villa was built. It's symptomatic of changing attitudes in the Brno city municipality that the villa of Löwbeer, situated at the bottom of the hill where the Villa Tugendhat was built, has also been restored. It doesn't have any particular architectural merit, but it stands as an important reminder of the city's history, and inside a small exhibition has been installed documenting not only the Löwbeer family, but also Brno's wider Jewish past. In this context, we might also mention the less well-known Villa Szczasny, built for Alfred Szczasny and designed by Ernst or Arnost Wiesner. Szczasny was another member of the Jewish industrial class in the city. Like the Tugendhats, Szczasny and his family escaped to South America in 1938, yet the fate of their villa exemplifies a common story. In 1939, along with the family business, it was Aryanized and passed into the ownership of Heinrich and Julius Kunert, who were textile entrepreneurs from northern Bohemia. After the war, the Kunerts fled to West Germany, where the company still exists, and the family, as well as the Kunert factories in Czechoslovakia, were nationalized by the communists. For a long time, the villa languished in the shadow of the Villa Tugendhat, but again, as a reflection of growing interest in the Jewish heritage of the city, it was declared a listed monument in 2009 and underwent a comprehensive renovation, opening to the public in 2014. Finally, in this context, we might note that the art collection of the Moravian Gallery in the city can trace its origins back to the private art collection of Julius Gompertz, one of the most important industrialists in the city and a leading member of Brno's Jewish community. His brothers Theodor and Max Gompertz were prominent figures in Vienna as respectively professor of classical philology and a financier, and his sisters, Sophie and Josefina, were renowned for the salons they held in the capital. Now, in one sense, I'm not making original claims here. One way or another, this is all public knowledge. Indeed, one of the most successful contemporary novelists in the Czech Republic, Katarzyna Tučková, has built a career around a series of novels, or historical fictions, they might better be called, that have explored the multi-layered history of Brno. The first, published in 2009, bore the title The Expulsion of Gerta Schnierch and addressed the expulsion of the German-speaking inhabitants of Brno in May 1945. 5 years later, in 2014, she published her second novel, Factory, a story of the textile barons of the Moravian Manchester that traced 5 generations of the family of the textile magnate Johann Heinrich Offermann. Yet for many Czechs, it was still a sufficiently unfamiliar story that when in the autumn of last year, the City of Museum of Brno staged, my apologies, how do I go back? Here we are. Been too keen here, staged an exhibition of work from its collection by 4 artists active in the decades either side of the turn of the century. It chose to title the exhibition The Other Face of Brno, for what all 4 had in common was the fact that they were German-speaking artists. Their personal biographies are emblematic of the interrupted culture and history of Central Europe. Beran, for example, was of Jewish origin, studied in Vienna, Munich, and Paris before the First World War, was active in the 1920s in Czechoslovakia, and then led a nomadic life moving from Spain to Britain to Portugal and ultimately the United States. He was not, however, a successful painter, and he was sustained financially by his wife, Irena Subakova, who had independent wealth and was a collector of artworks by painters such as Klimt, Kokoschka, Franz von Stuck, and Lovis Corinth. Yet even if the work was not of particularly great merit, it stands in stark opposition to the exhibition of interwar architecture in Brno on the floor above in the same museum. And it's part of a strategy on the part of the museum to diversify its image of Brno. For already in 2019, it had organized an exhibition that brought out the German-speaking cultural heritage of Brno, this time on the forgotten painter Emil Pirchan the Elder. Its title, Emil Pirchan, the Malerfürst of the Brno Ringstrasse. A year later, the Leopold Museum staged an exhibition on his son, who confusingly was also called Emil Pirchan. One could therefore speak of a kind of recovered history in the case of Brno that brings to the fore the very different cultural dynamics that operated from those in Prague. Indeed, one of the most important authors to have examined this issue in depth recently is the architectural historian Rostislav Koričánek, who pointed out that for many Czechs, Brno was a problem. Its German-Austrian character was something that they certainly complained about, or which they tried to ignore or even suppress. In 1897, for example, the author Josef Meerhout published a novel, Černá Pole, named after a northern suburb of Brno, that narrated the experience of a young man, Alois Philaus, who moves to Brno from Prague and is dismayed by its hybrid, impure character. I should note that Černá Pole is a suburb that includes the Villa Tugendhat, and it was home for many of the Jewish, sort of German-speaking Jewish population of the city. The only redeeming feature of Brno in the novel is the Czech cultural center, the Besední dům, designed by Theophil Hansen and built in the 1870s. Likewise, Koričánek points out Czech language guidebooks to the city before 1918 consciously avoided mention of buildings and monuments associated with Habsburg rule and its German-speaking population. This continued after the war. In 1919, Arnošt Heinrich, editor of the Lidové noviny newspaper, one of the main national newspapers, stated that before the war, and I quote, Brno was an unhappy city. Nobody liked it. For the Germans of Brno, it was just a suburb of Vienna. They maintained with all means and with a great deal of money, public money, moreover, the unsustainable fiction of its German character. They succeeded in arranging things in Brno very conveniently for themselves, again using above all public money, and they were a bastion of German aggression in the very heart of Moravia. Now, I shall leave aside the irony that both Meerhout and Heinrich had German names, or the fact that Heinrich's article contradicts itself. What's more significant here is that the mixed character of Brno was not something seen as giving it color or depth, even though this was precisely the narrative that the Habsburg administration sought to promote. As such, Brno was like one of many similar multicultural cities, such as Bratislava, Černivci, Rijeka, Subotica, in which inter-ethnic tensions were the norm. The significance of the fact for this paper is that after 1918, the municipal authorities sought to de-Germanize the city's urban fabric. Historical memory now of the architecture of interwar Brno tends to focus on those buildings designed in the language of the international style of modernism, such as the Zeman Cafe and the Avion Hotel by Bohuslav Fuchs, for example. Yet for Koričánek, for much of the 1920s, modernization meant the construction of monumental structures, often in a range of neo-traditionalist idioms that were part of a project of endowing it with an infrastructure that reflected its identity as a major city of the new Czechoslovak state. The history of the city's art and architecture cannot be fitted easily into optimistic narratives of Czechoslovak national identity formation either, except by a process of mythification in Barth's sense that elides the contradictions and conflicts involved. The International Exhibition of Contemporary Culture of 1928 was an important milestone in establishing the city's wider representation, but it was also, to a certain degree, a rather nationalist project. No German-speaking or Jewish architects were involved in this major project. Arnold Wiesner, who had already completed a number of significant large-scale commissions for the city, I can't remember if I noted, he was of Jewish origin, and many Czechs refer to him simply as the German, even though in fact he was born in Slovakia. Anyway, so Wiesner, who'd already completed a number of large-scale commissions in the city, was included only in as much he designed a house for a separate housing colony organized in conjunction with the exhibition. Historical accounts of the city's art and architecture fitted it into larger narratives of progress and modernization in Czechoslovakia. An illuminating example is, sorry, I've been too excited there, is Modern Architecture in Czechoslovakia by Karel Teiger, published in 1930. Teiger provided a teleological narrative of modern architecture and was full of praise for Brno, but only inasmuch as it was a center of the kinds of architecture he saw as progressive. But of course his account was simplistic and selective in its choice of examples, and it was in keeping with his overall position, which, despite his internationalist credentials as a Marxist theorist, or probably even because of them, couldn't accommodate the nuances that a city such as Brno would have required. He reiterated praise for Brno again in a polemic he published in 1934, Architecture, Right and Left, but it's a sign of his stance that he reduced contemporary architecture to the binary opposition of progressive and reactionary. It was a model that would be reiterated elsewhere in Czech publications such as For a Socialist Architecture by the Association of Leftist Architects in 1932, or Jan Kohler's Modern Architecture and its Development in the 20th Century of 1940. A notable place in this narrative is occupied by the Villa Tugendhat, now the most famous example of modernist architecture. It was for a long time rejected by Czechoslovak architects. Leftist critics, included Teiger, criticized the villa as a bourgeois betrayal of the social ideals of modernist architecture. In 1931, there was a lively debate in the German Werkbund magazine Die Form about the merits of the villa, to which even Grete Tugendhat contributed. But the fiercest criticisms were voiced in Czechoslovakia, many of which were politically motivated, and they continued after the Second World War under socialism. In 1963, Karel Honzík, for example, who had been a contemporary of Teiger, discussed it in his autobiography From the Life of the Avant-Garde, and he wasn't particularly complimentary about it. Quote, "It was more like a pavilion for exhibiting new materials than a place to live in," he said, "and it was experiments that had no wider use or significance." This was typical of judgments about the villa that only gradually began to change. As late as 1971, Zdeněk Kudělka, professor of architectural history at the University in Brno, asserted that for all its qualities, it had no relevance for the broader architectural history of the city. And in certain respects, it's difficult to disagree with him, because the villa occupies a strange place in the historiography of modernism in Brno. Ideological objections to its role as a representative of bourgeois luxury were undoubtedly significant, but it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that maybe, too, it seemed like an alien intrusion by a German architect for a wealthy Jewish class whose place in Brno was not always welcome, and who therefore interrupted the national narrative of progress that was so bound up with understandings of modernism. Now, I don't wish to dwell on the villa in itself for too long, but I would like to suggest it's just a very striking example of a larger phenomenon. And at this point, it's time to come to some conclusions. I've tried to sketch out ways that histories of modernism and the avant-garde have often been bound up with narratives of national identity, legitimation, and rebirth in Czechoslovakia. Yet, as I've suggested, such narratives can often be based on mythic images that circumvent or smooth over the rough ground that was actually crossed. Works of art and architectural history often repeat these broader historical accounts, but Brno offers a powerful example as to why such national histories can be problematic, since they rely on amnesia and a process of exclusion. Within Brno itself, there's been a significant and welcome shift in the historiographic landscape that has recognized not only its multi-layered past, but also the political, social, and ideological tensions that were generated. But there remains considerable work to be done. Some 5 years ago, a small volume of essays was published in Czech with the title, "How Should One Write Transcultural Literary Studies?" It was addressing a parallel problem in the domain of literary history. The history of Czech and German literature in the so-called Czech lands has, the authors contended, all too often been beset by nationalist frameworks that treat them merely as parallel stories. There is a continued absence, they suggest, of sustained study of how to conceptualize their relation, and therefore of how to write about the literary history of the Czech lands as a shared cultural space. As the authors of the book note, this weakness besets the treatment of Franz Kafka and Jaroslav Hašek, who, although they were contemporaries, inhabit entirely different worlds in the historiographic imagination. When we consider Brno, it's clear why much the same question is relevant for its art and architectural history too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have questions? Even one question.
Yeah, I will have one question because you've talked about the myth, yeah, and the myth in the between the worlds, and my question was because in the international functionalistic architecture, we cannot find really this propaganda styles on some propaganda messages for the population there. But we maybe, and you maybe can give us some examples. If we have some churches, because also in the sacralic architecture, we maybe can find also very interesting movements to bring some about the myth of the grounding of new Czechoslovak myth into to create something like that.
If you read my book that will be coming out next year, which is all about modernist churches, I'll give you the answer. Bit of self-promotion there. But more important, okay, there are two. It's rather complicated because it depends on the denomination. Generally speaking, churches have a very strange place in narratives of modernist architecture, and it's to do with the fact that the stories of modernist architecture are basically rely on a kind of theory of modernity as a process of secularization. It's the kind of thesis from Max Weber, and that means that it's very difficult. How do you account for churches? What place do they have? And of course, there are a few very famous churches, but they occupy a very strange place within the narrative, so whether it's Le Corbusier or let's think of Central Europe, things like, Plečnik's, church in Vinohrad in Prague. And I mean, Tiger didn't like it, he said it was just reactionary, which in Plečnik's case, I think he was right. But for a long time, people weren't, it was just simply designated as being anti-modern. Whereas I tend to the view that if you really, the thing is, there are so many churches were built, between the wars. I mean, in Hungary, which admittedly that was supposedly a Christian state, but hundreds and hundreds of churches were built between the wars, but nobody really knows what to say about them. But they were an important part of the urban fabric, so you have to say something about them. And if you want to do that, then you start having to revise what the term modern even means. What does it mean to talk about what does modern architecture mean? And of course, in Czechoslovakia, it was complicated because the Catholic Church was obviously Masaryk was very anti-clerical, very anti-Catholic, but then you had the Czechoslovak Hussite Church, which had state support.
That was the question about the role of
Yes, yeah. Yeah.
build even the new narrative about the Czechoslovak.
Yes, you can. Yeah, no, that's right, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, no, absolutely. So it is a complicated story, and of course, there are, you can talk about, if you talk about Central Europe, there are interesting parallels and differences, but it does mean that you have to be very careful when you start talking, even deciding what do you mean by modern? What does that mean? Yeah, yeah. But that would be, yeah, of course.
Miroslav, I want to comment on just very short comment for your question, because non-ecclesiastical architecture in modernism, of course, can have absolutely open ideological meaning. It's enough to look at Russians or at Soviets and at Italians. And in Italy, we have the same problem.
Yes.
We are, from one hand, constructing, like little example, the town of Tresigala, which is a fascist architectural showcase.
Yeah.
And then we are putting all the churches. And then Murcia constructing these churches every 5 meters.
Yeah.
Which is very finally going not fully with the ideological model of any Mussolini regime. Thank you very much.
No, that's right. And the other thing, moving away from architecture, is that more generally, it's been interesting how historians of modernist art have been quite happy to talk about the embrace of mysticism, of sometimes the most peculiar kinds, whether it's, Mondrian or Kandinsky or whoever, but they've been much more reluctant to talk about artists who were part of the established religions. They occupy a very peculiar place because nobody's really quite sure what to make of them.
And it's not only architecture. It's not only architecture.
No, it isn't. That's right. That's right. And you're right. And then there's the problem that Catholics, in particular, were really, a lot of them, not all, of course, but many were really pro-fascist, or and their political beliefs were very problematic as well.
Yeah. And don't forget that Italians constructed the old Holy Land.
Yeah.
All the British Mandate.
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
But that's a separate. That's a separate symposium.
We
I think.
invite the next speaker because we will never finish.
Thank you very much.
Marina. Marina.
Good morning. It is an honor and a great responsibility to be here and to represent the National Art Museum of Ukraine. I usually avoid any public speaking, but this time I decided to make an exception to present you with information about one of the Ukrainian modernist artists whose works aroused some interest at the Belvedere exhibition. I apologize in advance for my English. This is my first speech in a foreign language, but I hope, despite all this, I will be able to convey information about Vsevolod Maximovich, who was a representative of the Bohemian society of his time, who committed suicide at the age of 20, leaving a note that he was tired of living. Despite his short age, he managed to reach certain heights and create a significant number of artworks in various techniques, genres, and movements. The National Art Museum of Ukraine in Kyiv houses the largest collection of Vsevolod Maximovich's artworks. Currently, these are about 200 paintings and graphic works by the artist, which allow us to trace the evolution of the artist's work from amateurish children's and educational works to famous paintings created in the heyday of his creativity. You can see 5 of them at the exhibition in the Eye of the Storm. How exactly did Всеволод Maksimovich's works come to stay at the National Art Museum of Ukraine? It is important to explain this for further understanding of why the artist's name had been forgotten for a long time, and most of his works lost their author's titles. It is a really confusing story, but I will try to tell about it concisely. In the course of the research, it was possible to establish an almost complete provenance of the Всеволод Maksimovich's works, which are now kept in the National Art Museum of Ukraine. According to some sources, after the artist's death, his artworks were kept by Nadia Nikolaeva, a poet and a dancer with whom the young artist was in love. She is also known by her stage name Nada Elsner. It is difficult to say whether this is true or just another romanticized story, as no special evidence has been found yet. However, we have every reason to believe that artist's works were mostly kept by his mother, Olena Gavrilivna Maksimovich. This is evidenced by 2 documents dating back to 1920 and 1930, which are now stored in the archives of our museum. We are interested in a later document, which contains more detailed information about the acquisition of works. According to it, the museum received 53 paintings and 177 graphic works by the artist from the Contemporary Art Storage in Moscow, as well as a clay mask self-portrait of the artist, whereabouts of which are still unknown. All of these works were received from Всеволод's mother, Olena Gavrilivna, to perpetuate the memory of her late son. The fact that artist's mother took care of his works is also confirmed by a letter from museum employee Adelaida Artukhova to Fedor Ernst, date June 26, 1929. It states that the artist's mother asks that Artukhova receive his works for the museum, and then the museum staff did everything possible to ensure that the transfer of these works of art took place. As you can see on the slide, the museum received 230 paintings and graphic works, and only about 195 works are currently in storage. Why did this happen, and why the difference in numbers? According to the first results of the research, a significant part of the works was probably lost during the Second World War, and some were probably taken to Ufa in evacuation and never returned to their places of storage. Also, a small part of the drawings go to the Museum of Russian Art in Kiev, now the Kiev Art Gallery, where they are still kept. The fate of these works, it is complicated as the fate of the artist himself. In 1937 to 1939, due to historical circumstances related to the totalitarian policy of the Soviet Union, almost all of Maksimovich's works were transferred to the special secret fund, which was formed on the basis of our museum. It was here that the works of the so-called enemies of the people, formalists and nationalists, those who, according to party ideologies, distort reality and pose a threat to the new society, were placed. Maximovich's works were included in the special fund because they were defined as works of a low and ideological level, as they did not correspond to the party's policy. Thus, most of the artists whose works ended up in the special fund were erased from the history of Ukrainian art for a long time. Among them are the works of Vsevolod Maximovich, which after these changes lost even their original titles. Most of them were recorded in the inventory book of the special fund under others' name. Sometimes they are simply attributed to the artist Max, without the artist's full name. No one remembered or paid attention to these works, and for a long time the world had no idea that Vsevolod Maximovich, one of the brightest representatives of modernism, existed. The artist's name was brought back from oblivion in 1996 at an exhibition of his works in our museum. But before that, there was a great and painstaking work on the restoration of his paintings, which were without frames, some of them rolled up, dirty, and with partial loss of the bases. But the main breakthrough occurred only in year 2007. The exhibition Crossroads, Ukrainian Modernism, was successfully held in Chicago and New York. Among the works by Alexander Ekster, Alexander Bohomazov, David Burluk, and others, there were paintings by Vsevolod Maximovich. Now his paintings are exhibited at the Belvedere Museum. In this talk, I will try to tell about the life and work of Vsevolod Maximovich, to reveal all the facets of his undiscovered talent, to show his path on the example of those works that are kept at the National Art Museum of Ukraine. You will see most of them for the first time. However, it is worth nothing right away that the main source of studying Vsevolod Maximovich's work is, well, his works, because we have little information and documentary evidence about the artist. We know only various legends, stories, and isolated memoirs of contemporaries. And the various publications devoted to the artist in one way or another often give contradictory facts. It is also quite difficult to divide the stages of the artist's work with any precision. Nevertheless, I will try to recreate a preliminary, albeit somewhat short, history of the artist's life and work. Vsevolod Maximovich was born and raised in Ukrainian city Poltava. Unfortunately, the exact date of his birth is still unknown. The Poltava Regional Archive does not have any documents related to the artist family. This is largely due to the fact that most of archival materials were destroyed and some were illegally transferred to Moscow. I hope that soon we will be able to find at least some information about the artist. Vsevolod Maximovich received his artistic education from Ivan Mesyedov, the son of the famous painter Grigory Mesyedov. Maximovich's talented and charismatic teacher certainly influenced the young artist's future. It is worth saying a few words about Ivan Mesyedov himself. Even during his lifetime, Ivan was a kind of a mythmaker whose antics were reported by the press all the time. After receiving his academic education at the Moscow School of Painting, Sculpture and Architecture and the St. Petersburg Academy of Arts, he went on a trip abroad with his friend Fedor Krichevsky. Even when he lived in Poltava, though he was away on foreign trips, he organized and held a number of sporting events where he repeatedly won prizes for strength and beauty. The artist himself and his wife, the famous Italian dancer Malvina Vernici, were fond of the popular Naturmensch movement at the time, which was a return to nature and active recreation. At the beginning of the 20th century, Mesejedov organized in Poltava the artistic and philosophical association Garden of the Gods, a group of nudist athletes which also included artists Fedor Krichevsky, Solomon Smolany, Solomon Rosenbaum, and directors Volodymyr Gaidarov and Mykola Yevreinov. The members of the group went in for sports, posed nude, prepared theatrical performances, organized various entertainment events in the garden, and so on. Perhaps it was from this period that Maximovich developed a love of theater. Ivan Mesejedov and the cultural environment of Poltava certainly had a huge impact on the young Vsevolod Maximovich. Also, due to his young age, he probably joined the Garden of the Gods only in the last years of its short existence. Maximovich became one of Mesejedov's most famous students. He also adopted from his teacher not only love of antiquity and mythology, but also began to imitate his lifestyle, not to mention some elements of his appearance. This can be seen by comparing the self-portraits of the two talented artists. The resemblance between the portrait is obvious. A hairstyle with thick, dark, curled hair, black eyeliner. In the case of Mesejedov, it is known that it was a tattoo. The self-portraits of the two artists from the Garden of the Gods, a center of Art Nouveau and symbolism, make a rather strong impression on the viewer despite their certain coldness and detachment. The following works can be attributed to the early as well as Poltava period of Vsevolod Maximovich's work. Damon, the Panthea, and female profiles. We can also include Maximovich's Crimean sketches, which we assume he could have created while staying in the Mesejedov's cottage. It is known that this was the Darsan cottage in Yalta, where the members of the Garden of the Gods, led by Ivan Mesejedov, came to visit. This work can be dated to around 1912. In these Crimean sketches by Vsevolod Maximovich, which for a long time were listed in the museum documentation as fantastic landscapes, we see experiments with color and textures. The artist even added sand from the Crimean coast to some sketches. After 1910s, the artistic life of Poltava changed its course somewhat, becoming less intense then. For example, in the heyday of the Garden of Gods, at the time creative process intensified quite sharply, and the artistic life of Ukraine was concentrated in large cities. It was not surprising that Maximovich decided to move to Moscow. Probably not without the advice of Ivan Mesejedov, who had studied at the Moscow School of Paintings, Sculpture, and Architecture. So, Vsevolod Maximovich continued his studies at the Moscow School Studio of Fedor Rerberg, where Kazimir Malevich, Alexander Bogomazov, Volodymyr and Ludmila Burluk, and other famous Ukrainian artists had previously studied. Here Maximovich met famous futurists: Mikhail Larionov, Velimir Khlebnikov, Vasil Kamensky, the Sinakov sisters, and others. which to a certain extent would shape the future of the young artist. One of feature of Rehberg's studio was its director's interest in painting technology, which he studied not only in theory but also in practice. In this regard, the studio began to resemble a kind of paint shop where one could learn painting technology from their own experience while studying. Also, Всеволод Maximovich studied in such an atmosphere. The rules learned in Rehberg's studio further influenced the artist's own technique. Experimenting with materials became particularly one of the foundation of Maximovich's painting technique, who often used tempera and oil paints within the same painting. In some cases, he added resins, wax, as well as bronze and aluminium powder. Among the graphics that clearly belong to this period are studio sketches. Drawings of models, fighters. All the time he created caricature portraits. For example, a portrait of Ivan Bunin and a caricature of the opera singer Leonid Sobinov. In 1912, he also created more classical portraits. For example, man's portrait, portrait of Shore, and portrait of Mykola Maximovich, the artist's father. In 1930, like many of these contemporaries, he became fascinated by Isadora Duncan's performances and various stories by Edgar Allan Poe. As I mentioned before, the heyday of Всеволод Maximovich's creativity was in 1912 to 1914. It was then that the most famous paintings were created. Kiss, Banquet, Masquerade, Passion, and others. It is worth noting that in 1912, the artist was only 17 years old. As for Ivan Merseydov, the most important images for Всеволод Maximovich were those of antiquity, their high cult of fertility and body beauty. His work is also characterized by a dramatic juxtaposition of colors, white and black, red and black, etc., which refers to ancient Greek vase painting and Poltava folk ornamentation. In March to April 1914, shortly before the artist's death, a personal exhibition of Всеволод Maximovich's works was held at the Moscow German Club. It should be noted the two graphic works exhibited were selected for the prestigious international exhibition of the book industry in Leipzig. But before the 20 intense months of the artist's creativity life, during this short period, he managed not only to organize a personal exhibition, but also to play one of the main roles in the avant-garde silent film Drama in Cabaret No. 13. This was an experimental production by Mikhail Larionov, a two-part tragicomedy created with director Volodymyr Kasyanov and the Winkler and Toporkov Film Company. Volodymyr Kasyanov wrote in his memoirs, "One day in late autumn, a group of guests came to our office. Mayakovsky, Burlyuk, Shershenevich, Kamensky, Larionov, Goncharova, and someone else. The guests made us an offer to make a futuristic film with their character based on their script, Cabaret No. 13. The plot was short. The production costs were low. The authors themselves were interested in getting only one printed copy of their movie as a souvenir, and we went along with it. The film was shot, printed in only 2 copies, one of which was given to the authors, and the second copy was shown to distribution offices and theater owners whose first attempt to create a futuristic film was unsuccessful. It becomes clear why the film is considered lost. Only a few frames are known, published in various sources. However, the plot remains known, published in the review Futurist on the Screen, thanks to which we can get a general idea of the film. You can see the beginning of the story on the screen. Vsevolod Maximovich was precisely the one who played the role of a futurist artist. In one of the surviving shots, we see Maximovich with rays painted around his eyes, which refers to Mikhail Larionov and Ilyas Danevich's manifesto, Why We Paint on Ourselves. On the shoulder and half-naked chest of his victim, whom the artist holds in his arms, there is a sharp, sickle-shaped line, thanks to which this victim is attributed to Natalia Goncharova. The film also stars Mikhail Larionov, David and Volodymyr Burlyuk, and other members of the futurist community. The film's posters only listed the names of Mikhail Larionov and Natalia Goncharova, and the total, somewhat mysterious number of participants, 130 people. This is probably why there was some confusion. Some sources say that Larionov and Goncharova played the main roles, and Maximovich's name was not even mentioned in this context for a long time. The descript shot is also interesting because we see Vsevolod Maximovich in the same outfit as in his self-portrait. This is even more evident in the second surviving image where Vsevolod Maximovich stands next to Mikhailo Larionov over the body of Natalia Goncharova. Comparing these images with Vsevolod Maximovich's self-portrait, it is difficult not to notice the similarities. This comparison also makes it possible to put an end to the attribution of the image, sweeping aside other various assumptions. 1940, this is the year of the artist's death. For quite a long time, there were contradictory facts about his death, as well as about his life in general, in which one should try to find at least a drop of truth. There was even information that the artist showed himself in the temple. Sometimes one can also come across the information, the date of death on May 3rd, 1914. After comparing the information about artist's death in several Moscow newspapers of the time, we can state the following. Vsevolod Maximovich committed suicide on April 23, 24th, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, taking a large dose of morphine in his apartment. He was sent to the first city hospital in Moscow, where he died a few hours later. What prompted the young artist to commit suicide? Was it unhappy love or the failure of a personal exhibition, as some researchers write? One thing is for sure, we will probably never know the truth. What is known is that Maximovich left a note on the table in his apartment, addressed either his end. Don't blame anyone. Life is too boring to live. Vsevolod Maximovich lived a short but eventual life, leaving behind more than 200 paintings and graphic works, most of which are now kept in the National Art Museum of Ukraine. Among them are various still lifes, Crimean landscapes, portraits and caricatures of prominent figures, illustration to Edgar Poe stories. Once famous among the futurists, he was forgotten for many years, and his works remained in storage for many years, waiting to be recognized. In this presentation, I showed only a small part of the artist's work. There are still many inaccuracies surrounding the life and work of artists that require careful research, while his work requires new attributions. The research is ongoing, and I hope it will reveal even more interesting and important facts for the study and understanding of the Vsevolod Maksimovich's creativity. Thank you.
Marina, thank you very much. Very interesting material, provoking many parallels, like, I don't know, the circle of Sasha Schneider in Germany with bodybuilding, naturalism, nakedness, homoerotic poetics. Very interesting. Do we have any questions?
Can I just start by thanking you, and obviously if this was your first talk in a foreign language, congratulations. Something that Konstantin said at the very beginning, which was points of reference. And just while you were talking, I confess, I just looked him up on my phone, okay? And I noticed there was an article by the British Library that was talking about him, saying he was the Ukrainian Aubrey Beardsley, and it's obvious that there are connections, which is very interesting. But, I mean, was he, and there were magazines that published work by Beardsley in Kiev. So, I mean, was he the only person, or was there a wider interest in Beardsley or other British artists at that time in Ukraine?
Marina, він питає, чи його зацікавленість Beardsley. Чи ми маємо в Україні інші приклади такої зацікавленості?
Konstantin will translate.
Yeah, I will translate. Yeah.
Окей. Насправді в інших художників прям такої зацікавленості творчістю Бердслея немає. Єдине, трошечки можна це побачити, але дуже натягнуто у творчості Георгія Нарбута.
Marina is saying that, surprisingly, no. Basically, he is a unique case. We can see some influence, but very artificial, superficial influence in some works of Narbut, which are probably even earlier in chronology. So it's a unique national Beardsley, and it's a big Beardsley. Yeah.
But I'd like to say that there must be something there, because Petritsky does this beautiful painting called Herodiada. So there has to be some source that is feeding the Beardsleyan motif.
Yeah, there is a very interesting question in general, which you're touching, the question of sources. So what they could see, what was reproduced. And of course, they are not only relying on Kiev magazines, they are looking through Apollon, Mir Искусства, what's coming up in Moscow and St. Petersburg magazines, and they're looking at some Studia International again. So they have an idea.
Thank you so much, Svetlana Shields. I want to let a little bit light on Matthew's questions and also on Maksimovich, because what I saw, one source, one important phenomenon that is missing and which can connect it all, is Japanism. Beardsley was extremely popular with Mir Искусство in St. Petersburg, and of course, echo of it came to Moscow 100%. But what we see in Maximovich, we can see Hokusai, which was never talked about. And Japanese made something what Beardsley was crazy about, and Narbut and Maximovich again. So just wanted to make this note that to answer help to answer your question. So that was Japanese. Thank you.
Marina, thank you very much. We have to move to the next speaker, and finally to learn how we can write the history of Central European art.
I don't need it. It is start. Yeah, and you see it. Okay. You see the next slide. Okay. Okay. Thank you. When we can start? Yeah. Okay. Oh. Thank you for invite for this meeting. I have divided my talk into 3 parts. In the first one, I will recall selected recognitions by Professor Matthew Rampley from Text Network, Horizons Center and Hierarchies. In the second part, I will point out what concerns me about the proposal for a way out of the impasse. In the third part, I will present a proposal for change of routine using an example which is, I think, as simplest is substance. The naively indicated the title of my talk lies in the fact that I'm not considering here financial and institutional difficulties that the 2-track international team would encounter. This is all the more so because the undertaking would be a multi-stage activity. In the reference text, Professor Matthew Rampley extremely insightfully characterized the direction of the explanation to date. Why modern art of the Central and Eastern European countries is essentially absent from the research works of Western art historians. He presented both extensive dissertation and important mentions of both representatives of the nations concerned, situated between Germany and Russia and whose of Western Europe. Rampley is an outsider looks critically, encounters world ground with attention, so it is a very important view. He points out the intricate specific context of local histories. She knows these our stories, it's chapeau bas, and compares the forms of effects of disputes from the distance with a unique and not only among Western art history. They demonstrated the same of the most important mechanism of resentment and various national assertions. Meaning is not articulated because it is not in doubt, which Rampler links to Stanley Fish notions of an interpretative community. The researcher noticed both the intricate phenomena described in explicit in art criticism and in the programmatic declaration of the groups and the non-obvious unnamed ones. For the territories of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, for example, it is the overlooked ability of the state to counterbalance inter-ethnic disputes, or the overlooked positive effects in Vienna cultural radiation. The result in a widespread appreciation of the dominance of artists' contact with Paris. In the Polish literature on the subject, it is something the case that biographies of artists do not mention several years of study in the Vienna, for example, in Kunstgewerbeschule, which had a significant practical effects, or regular participation in exhibition, but even just a month's stay in Paris is always emphasized. For nations without independent state, the French capital offered independence from the Austrian invaders, and it is to warrant of contact with modernity. In the Polish, Belarusian, Lithuanian, and Ukrainian case, the information about contacts with the environment of the Academy of Fine Arts in Petersburg is much worse. One can only admit to contacts with, for example, with Diaghilev after that, when he came to Paris. In this part of Europe, political history has all too often determined the character of cultural relations. Professor Rampler begins the recapitulation of the view of the absence of Central and Eastern European art in the critique of Piotr Piotrowski conception. As is well known, the Polish researcher attempted he see on it in new way. He order of the relationships between the center and province. The method of description based on this concept, definitely by a hierarchical vertical structure, he considered as an ideological construct. Instead, he proposed a network of horizontal connections between the marginal centers. Piotrowski's observation clearly relates to post-colonial criticism. Professor Rampler also placed his consideration in the context of Hegel. The cultural omnipotence of the center is kind of delusion in this conception. Also, Piotrowski does, after all, see inequalities. He pointed to be institutional accumulation of economic and cultural capital in the region for the legion of Central and Eastern European countries behind the Western neighbors. Professor Rampler sees weakness of Piotrowski's thinking and conclusions such. I will only take here that I need in next part. A lack of evidence that a researcher looking at the center from the provinces it between knows more about it than who is inside and from the inside. Second, according to the reality known to all, cultural centers are not ideological constructs. They have exist, they really exist, and they will exist. The binary opposition cannot be denied, and the extensive of the links indicated by Piotrowski between the similar centers of the province does not cause the center to weaken. So, binary opposition cannot be cut out of the discourse of art history. In other words, while the relegation of Central and Eastern European to the margins was disastrous, it does not necessarily mean delegitimizing the talk of centers peripheries per se. What will remain of the Polish reflection in the research will be an accurate characterization of the effects of the enormous accumulation of cultural capital in the United States, Germany, France, and United Kingdom. Unfortunately, this diagnosis is still valid. The imbalance of power and symbolic capitals is still true. The great positive of Piotrowski's theory, which has been developed over several years and has been debated, in the great international revival of discussion of this topic. Before I move on what concerns me about Professor Rampley's suggestions for changing the situation and overcoming the absence of research on Central and Eastern European art in publication of Western colleagues, I will point out an important, for my point of view, difference in terminology. It concerns the chronological scope of the term modern art, modernism. We have, 2 years ago, was edition the fat book about this problem with international themes that I don't go deeply in that. In the Anglo-Saxon tradition, modern art is all that follows the Middle Ages. In the Polish academic tradition, after the Middle Ages, is sztuka nowoczesna, equivalent to early modern, without that word modern. It is something like a new art. Sztuka nowoczesna includes the Renaissance, Baroque, and any classicism of entertainment. Modern art compares the years ca. 1800-1939. The years 1918-1939 are a classical model, which the avant-garde function, abstraction, expressionism, and functionalism in architecture, art deco, etc. In such an order, Piotrowski's theses do not only apparently, as Rampley writes, refer to the to tense cultural politics of the Habsburg Empire, in which artistic practice were closely linked to questions of nationality and identity. They refer precisely to this time as the beginning of Piotrowski reflection. This follows from a different definition of the modern art. Therefore, when writing about modern art, Piotrowski is not interested in modern as early modern art, for example, for a 17th century art. Rampley points out that art historians from Central and Eastern Europe should choose the right topic and the right way to interest. Western art historians Western art historians, excuse me. He pointed to Polish example that has potential in terms of content, but described it as unadapted opportunity. He recalled Tomasz Grusiecki. Uprooting Origins, Polish-Lithuanian Art and the Challenges of Pluralism. He saw as flaw in this essay the narrowing down to a dual Polish-Lithuanian relationships of the topic that had the potential to interest not only these two nations or these foreign scholars who already know a lot about the culture of the former Commonwealth realm places, the possibility of overcoming the marginalization of this essay here in introduction of a border narrative showing the intertwining of Islamic and Christian art in Europe, in which the Polish example would be only one of many. Grusiecki, continuing his research, somewhat meets this expectation, as in article on Western reception of the so-called Polish carpet, excuse me, Polish carpet, at the exhibition in France and in the Western collectors market. A little later, in his book Transcultural Things and the Spectra of Orientalism in Early Modern Poland, Lithuania, he seems to produce it little further in the direction indicated by Rampley. However, from my point of view, I deal with the history of modern art around 18 to 1939. Paradoxically, it can be said that the later misfortunes of the Commonwealth came from complemency of the nobility and suburban adherence of Sarmatian attitudes. Advocates of modernity at that end of the 18th century in the Commonwealth dressed in modern way, that it's mean in French style, and wanted nothing to do with contours and the Orient. Contours is a special man's wedding. Modern from the end of the 18th century, also in art, a turn towards the West. The volume from which Rampley selected Grusiecki text includes articles on 19th and 20th century Polish art. Among them, of the article discussing a topic recently present in European research, the organization of international exhibition. Jörg Scheller showed presence of Polish artists in the Venice Biennale. It is panorama. I find something from 1936. And yet in terms of the basis of the Polish modern offer to the West, could be only Eastern exoticism. For the popularization of Polish and Lithuanian sztuka nowoczesna, modern art, it is indeed one of the positive impulse. But for modernity in the indicated Polish distinction, where modernity in a separate chapter of the history of art, as used Piotrowski. This recommendation may lead to consternation. It is impossible to shift this kind of attraction to be exoticism of the Orient to a time after 1800. And this is where we have modernity. In addition to the questions of what subject, in what context, and for which reader an art historian from Central and Eastern European should write, another question has to be asked. The strand of art history is conducive to such a form of attraction. Obviously, as cited above, it should be studies in the visual culture. Arguably, this is the case. I understand that it is about the effects, attracting attention. What is difficult to accept that in this necessity develops in-depth research, hermeneutic, semiotic, and post-semiotic analysis, which visual culture draws on, but sometimes, especially source work, archival work, and from some kind of expressive, defines an absolute form of art history. What can be done for this attraction to go beyond Orientalism, to move in time to 19th and 20th century? I don't hope that any rapid break throws in the introduction of both Central and Eastern European art itself and related research into the broad cultural canon. Even if, as Professor Lampley recommends, the modus vivendi changes, what it is need is basic work calculated to have a slow effect. My idea is directly related to the place and the group in which we are talking. It is joining of forces, museum professionalists, and university researchers. I believe that art of Central and Eastern Europe should be shown in international coexist. Exhibition and research should be complementary. This requires a good definition of the attractive universal theme, so that exhibition and lectures can be travel capitals through Europe. As I point out, I have no idea how to organize the things administratively and financially. Expect that the cost should be shared between the several states. And this could be difficult too, because exhibition would be programmatically avoid national representation. Comparisons are an essential tool for cognition. It might be that the juxtaposed subjects, the art resource of a country might be different time in different genres, and themes have different respectional potential. It is necessary to define why a work is relevant, e.g., read of assertion, which naturally carries its risk that quantitative and qualitative differences may prove troublesome. Cultural centers exist and have power. So my example proposal points Vienna because of the historical context. As you can guess, I'm returning to the exhibition from inside the epoch, as Professor Rampel described Hagenbund project in Belvedere. One has to agree with his diagnosis that the text on the individual nations juxtaposed side by side do not show a panorama of the Hagenbund phenomenon. Such a summary was lacking. And excellently organized teams did a tremendous amount of research work. The lack pointed out by the professor might have been influenced by the lack pointed out by the professor might have been influenced by the fact that the exhibition and the accompanying study, for it is definitely more than catalog, when somewhat ahead of the project closure. The example I have chosen per analogiam would allow one to build on the experience and embark a new path. This is a new look at Ausstellung der Vereinigung Bilder den Künstlerinnen Österreich, die Kunst der Frau 1910. It was certainly an artistically consolidating event, which could still be used today. Of course, many articles we have about it, but I think that international meeting, a personal presentation, and presentation many part of archives that are about this exhibition, not only in Vienna but in Munich. I find that in Warburg Archive and in Hungary Academy of Science. It is very interesting material. When we connecting to that, a contemporary artist from all countries that was on this exhibition, and adding the new artist from new country after the 1918, it will be very big project, and I think that it is idea that connecting many persons, many artists, and many idea. It is finished. Rudolf Arnheim wrote that the entropy of events and artists and commerce in art means more than it seems. Perhaps this also applies to the art historian. When working Hagenbund, I show Kerstin Jesse a presentation about Boznańska. It is some from that. Duczyńska, Kowysz-Hazy, it was friend. Boznańska and Mary Warburg, that correspond about a meeting in bureau or that exhibition. 3 years later, in Belvedere Library, Kerstin Jesse said, I found your Boznańska in manuscript by Alfred Wickenburg. He described her studio. He was brought there by Victor Gebsatel, who was a frequent visitor in Studio Boznańska's in Paris. Not by chance, as he is pioneer of research into the psychology of vision and visual memory in relation to the painting. The meetings, like the centers, were and are powerful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Wait. Don't run away. I think that we will have questions. Do we have questions? I'm sure other people have something. No. I am going to the obvious suspect.
Well, can I just say something?
Yeah, I thought that you want to say something.
I mean, I don't. This is supposed to be about Ukraine. It shouldn't be about some cranky English person. But you're not quite right about when you talk about Anglo-Saxon tradition, because people don't talk about it like that. The other thing is that there is no such thing as an Anglo-Saxon tradition. I know people in France like to talk about that, but it really doesn't exist, because the English-speaking world is so big. I mean, if I go to the States, it's a completely alien world. You know, American academics, they talk in different ways, they behave, they even dress in different ways. There are these massive cultural differences. And even within Britain, I mean, Scotland is very different from England, so you have to be very careful to avoid these kinds of generalizations, I think, about, you know, the Anglo-Saxon tradition, because there isn't one. That's all I'd say. But I mean, I'm sure we could have a conversation over coffee or something, because I'm sure there are other people who want to ask questions.
More questions? Okay, then.
I will have it later. Just to comment that ideas of Piotr Piotrowski is very important for Ukrainian art history, I think, but it's different, very, but it's almost unknown in Ukraine. I mean, he's writing with a very, actually, I'm persuaded Boris Filomenko is publishing, to publish Avant-Garde in the Shade of Yalta. It must be written in Ukraine. It's not Ukraine, it's not in, and that's why it should be written in.
It's important. It's a bit aged, this approach, but it has to be known.
He have to be known. Then we can have a part in this discussion. For now, no comment, since it's not in circulation.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I wrote that article, a lot of people were I don't think they quite understood what I was trying to do, because obviously it's an important article, and his book, but the two books actually, on, you know, post-89 and post-Yalta, I mean, I still think they're excellent books. There's an irony that when I was still based in Britain, nobody had really heard of Piotrowski. You know, he was marginal. But there are problems with, you know, the way he talks about the West. And I think, you know, I've got no idea what that means, actually. And if you're based in Central Europe, then Britain seems very marginal. But as far as he's concerned, Britain is part of the centre. But it all depends on your perspective. It's all...
Based in America, Britain looks very marginal.
Yeah, it does. Absolutely, absolutely. And so I think, you know, this is the concern, I think, with this use of, or even trying to discount, you know, to kind of pretend that talking about that there are no centres, that we can do away with it. You know, there are certain... I don't think you can, because there are... Well, it's what... Still think about two really important writers, Carlo Ginzburg and Enrico Castelnuovo. You know, this very important essay on symbolic domination and hegemony. It's there. It's a historical reality, and you can't just wish it away. But what you can do is to try and devise strategies for being able to overcome it. And that's what I was suggesting, is that at the moment, I think in many parts of Central and Eastern Europe, historians of art are ultimately still using a framework that is counterproductive. It's all to do with how you frame it. So even things like, I mean, people still use stylistic labels, which I think is problematic, because then immediately you start comparing things with something that started in... I mean, there's a very good example by... dissection of this, and I think I mentioned it in the article, by Jindřich Vyberal. He's a very fine architectural historian in Prague, and he talks about Czech cubism. And everybody knows about Czech cubism, but it's a counterproductive category, he says, because first of all, when Czech cubists were actually producing cubist works, they didn't think they were cubists. So that book that I showed you by Kramarz, when he's talking about cubism, he's just talking about France. He doesn't mention a single artist in the Czech lands. I think that's right, isn't it? Or is it? Very, very rarely. And then the other thing that Vyberal says is the problem is that cubism, it's about trying to get legitimation by being compared to what was going on in Paris. It's like saying, oh, we were there too. But that means that you're always being seen as a kind of, you know, like the second best of something that was happening in Paris. And so better really just think of a completely different way of framing the art history. So, you know, so you don't make these kind of comparisons, maybe.
May I? Only short comment. I will address this problem in my paper, of course, but I wanted to add something to the discussion about Piotrowski and about the fact that his theories are aged and we need to build on it. And I think we need representatives from our own region. And in this context, I would like to mention work of Sanja Beuhen. She is a literary historian. Today she's based in Essex, but she comes from Bulgaria. And she thinks about our region in perspective from our perspective. She's based in Essex, but still she has this experience, and she talks about this interpositionality. And I think it's something that is quite topical, and we can build on it. We can think about its connection to the original Piotrowski thought, and yeah, we have to carry on because I think our perspective is very important.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You see, it was very provoking speech. Thank you.
For Saxon, Anglo-Saxon tradition, you're full right. It is my mistake. I think about maybe English speaking, not that I'm right. And the second, Piotrowski, theory of Piotrowski is important, yes, but I agree in all that Professor Rampley write about that theory, because it is ideological construction and sometimes not logical. That I think, but it is important, of course. I think that I was so pity that in the beautiful article, all nations have modern representation, but only Poland have carpet from Iran. Then, yes.
More often to Hungary, we have a lot of carpets from the Ottoman Empire and Iran in a Sharkhati collection. Thank you very much. Great. Wow.
Yeah, thank you. That was not just a discussion, this was a next lecture. Thank you. We have now, please just show us, we have now a lunch break, more than 1 hour, and then we have the second panel at 2 o'clock. So please, enjoy the break, and we see us here at 2. Thank you.